Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film itself, but to have a close-up look at the film's 3D with some thoughts about how well it works. And today we're looking at the young and prodigious TS Spivet. That's Jean-Pierre film from 2013. He's the guy who made Amélie, but if you're not a fan of French language films, you'll be happy that this one is in the English language, set in the USA. The aspect ratio is 2.39 to 1, which is something I'll come back to later, and the film was shot in native 3D. Whilst being shot with 3D cameras isn't always a sign of this, this is one of those films that I'd call a genuine 3D film. That's to say that the 3D element is clearly very deeply embedded within the film's entire production, and not only would I call this a genuine 3D film, but amongst those, this is an absolute thoroughbred where the amount of care, attention to detail and skill that was put into its 3D, I think really earns this a place right up there alongside the all-time classic 3D movies. The film opens with a chapter heading, of which there are a few throughout, that's presented in the form of a pop-up book. It's a sort of whimsical and creative, and it looks nice in 3D, and to me it almost feels like a reference to the fact that this is how quite a few people seem to think 3D films look, like layers of flat cardboard cutouts. And they even throw in a scene later in the film where TS is hiding from someone in between two cardboard cutout characters, and it feels almost as if the film is saying, this is what cardboard cutouts look like, but as you can see, the rest of our film looks nothing whatsoever like that. And it really doesn't. This film is absolutely filled from start to finish with gorgeous, solid-looking 3D. It looks to me like pretty much every shot in the film has been composed to look good in 3D. The production design usually fills the frame across every axis with things in the foreground, middle ground and background, and if some of these are locations rather than sets, they look like they've been well chosen for their very three-dimensional structures. There was a similar shot of a lecture theatre in the post-converted 3D film San Andreas, which is a great venue for 3D, with not only the rows of seats but also the depth down to the lecturer. And funnily enough, San Andreas also had a shot where a television camera moves towards and out of the screen, just like this one. Multiple rows of anything always tend to offer good 3D, so this schoolroom is another really nice shot with a flag in the foreground there just for good measure. I think that whereas shots like this make for perfectly good 3D, the same sort of shot can be used to create great 3D when it plays a powerful role in the drama, like this view of TS, where the depth in the composition of the tables plays a significant part in placing him as an isolated figure in the background. It's worth mentioning, I think, that the stereographer here is a guy called Dimitri Portelli, who'd previously worked on another 3D classic, Martin Scorsese's Hugo, and his work here is of the same sort of quality. It's nice to see his credit at the end of the film, which I think is the most fun stereographer credit that I can remember seeing, with diagrams showing double imaging, convergence points, and a little stereoscope there. So I think there are a number of things that set this apart from the majority of 3D films, particularly a lot of the post-converted ones. Firstly, and whilst this might sound like a relatively minor technical thing, I think it's always worth mentioning, and that's that post-converted films just can't begin to show some things like foliage in the kind of detail that natively shot films can. So the grass here looks absolutely gorgeous, and coupled with the strong colour palette on show here, the power of the 3D does help to place you into the somewhat unusual world in which this film is set. But I think there are some much more fundamental things that place this film well above a large number of other 3D films, foremost of which is the way the film was shot. It's such a joy these days to see a film where someone on the camera team brought a tripod along to the production, which I like to think they're trying to reference here, and even better, they often lock the camera into position and let the action create the movement rather than any fast-moving camera work. And I think a lot of films used to be shot this way. Maybe it was the sort of MTV generation that helped to define the way that far too many modern films look, and I suppose the ease of editing in the digital age hasn't helped. In my opinion, there is a place in filmmaking for quick edits and shaky cam and frantic camera moves, but it's a much more limited place than we tend to see, and thankfully this film doesn't use any of those techniques, which in my book is a bonus even in 2D, but in 3D it's a massive bonus. And also the cinematography here is bright and colourful and crystal clear, so in other words, this is shot shot the way that I think a film should be if 3D is considered to be a crucial part of the package. When the camera does move, it almost always does so beautifully slowly, like here, and more grass there, which is kept in the foreground throughout the camera's movement. Lots of other camera moves serve the 3D perfectly, like moving solidly across the depth of the railway lines here, or moving in through this room, which has even been dressed with those curtains fluttering into 3D space, icing on this delicious 3D cake. There might be some slightly hyper-stereo shots, which is what this landscape looks like to me. It's not super strong, but it does look a little bit more three-dimensional than I think the natural view would appear to be. Same sort of thing looking across at this building. It feels like the rig would have been wound up here to its fullest lens separation, so they avoid making either of these views look flat, which I think could have happened at this sort of distance. And going in the other direction, it looks like they've got a couple of stunning macro shots, presumably with very little separation between the lenses, to give us these really lovely close-up views of insects. So this time high-po stereo, again with a strength in the 3D that's impossible to see in reality because our eyes are too far apart. There's a shot where the camera appears to pull back from the inside of a car right through the rain-spattered window, and TS's narration at the time says, the amazing thing about water drops is they always take the path of least resistance. For humans, it's exactly the opposite. It's a lovely line, and it made me smile as we've just taken a path of extreme resistance through a car's window, and the 3D effect here is, as ever in this film, very wonderful. And being framed through a rain-covered window is always a bit of a winning 3D shot, so it's nice to see it done again here with Helena Bonham Carter, who's great in this film as the mother, and this is one of those shots whose symbolism works fine in a 2D film, but is just so much better in a 3D film. There's a shot often used in 3D films where we're looking down on someone high up on a ladder, and it seems like this film is almost being playful with that shot by showing little TS on a tiny little ladder here, although the 3D is still excellent. For those who crave pop-outs from their 3D films, this film has plenty to offer, and while some of it is subtle, there are shots that go all in with the pop-out effect, like TS thrusting this prop sword way out of the screen, and like every shot in the film, this isn't the all too often blink and you'll miss it type of shot, but it's held for a nice long time. And better than that sword is this shot of a gun. So I think the most used shot of all in the whole history of 3D cinema is probably a gun being held towards the camera and out of the screen. Some films do it better than others, and to my eyes, this is one of the best examples of it you'll ever see. It's a nice, brightly lit shot, the shot's held for plenty of time, the cameraman is sober, plus it's a rifle with a long barrel so it comes a good way out of the screen, and better still, it's all contained within the frame, and the depth of field in the focus covers pretty much everything from the tip of the barrel to the house way in the background. And if all of that sounds like the obvious way to do it, it's always amazing to me how many 3D films don't do the pop-out gunshot, anything like as well as this, ignoring one or two or even all of those basics. But even better than all of that, and by way of example of why I think this film's 3D is something very special, the Winchester here is a major dramatic piece of the story, so showing it in a strong 3D shot is very significant. I really do think there's a level of quality in the stereography here that's quite sensational and all too rare. While we're looking at that gun, in the same sequence they do something that's been seen in other 3D films, including actually Gemini Man, which Dimitri Portelli also worked on several years after this, and that's to put some 3D effect into the view through a telescopic sight. So that's not realistic, of course, only looking through it with one eye, but I'd always take a 3D view over a 2D one, even if strictly speaking it's incorrect. And by the way, in case this view might be putting you off the film, don't worry, of course he doesn't shoot the cat. I've mentioned that telescopic sight shot in a couple of other films previously, and far more often I've mentioned the binocular shot, that's to say the view through a pair of binoculars not being as hyper-stereo as I think it could be, as well as it being presented in that very non-real world view of the horizontal figure of 8, and that's the way this film plays it too, but I'm not for 1 second complaining about it, and actually I really like this binocular view with all of these scratches on the viewing lenses being placed into strong 3D space. And on the subject of viewing devices, so I've already mentioned binoculars, telescopic sights and stereoscopes, but there are a couple more to come, one of which is this thing, which looks to me like a stereo microscope. Avatar had the same tease as this film does, which is to show someone using one of these things, but then not letting us see the view, which is a tiny shame, but obviously not a problem. I really only mentioned that to reach for something less positive, otherwise this would just be me heaping praise upon praise for this film. In fact, just to get all of my negatives out of the way at the same time, I have a couple of non-3D related ones, which are that I wonder if it's maybe slightly irresponsible for the film to show someone feeding chocolate to a dog when chocolate is poisonous and very dangerous for dogs and can kill them, or somebody putting out a fire in an electric toaster by throwing water over it, which is obviously very dangerous to humans and can kill them. Actually, I do have one other minor observation of a very small issue with 3D, and that's when during this theatrical moment there are some particles falling amongst the performers, and particles can look superb in 3D, but these particles look like some sort of glitter, and that's not so effective in 3D, I think, because the light reflected off them is so directional that it doesn't necessarily hit both eyes together at the same time, which I think is maybe why this sequence is perhaps not quite as excellent as the rest of the film. And really, it is excellent. This is an exquisite 3D production, where even on the odd occasion where it looks like the 3D might not be doing much, it's actually doing a huge amount. So for example, TS on the phone here, and he, along with most of the rest of the view, is towards the back of the frame, but the floor stretches way back along the Z-axis from us towards him. And this has the effect of creating a feeling of empty space in the room, which in turn shows TS as someone standing alone. And I think that the same sort of thing is at play here in this outside shot. The ground is full of a strong 3D effect, which creates a sense of empty space in the nothingness of the outdoors, with the kid placed by himself in that space. So faces in close-up are very solid looking, and more so when the drama has a particular reason for them to be, like this guy on the right of the screen who's saying something that's not on the side of our young hero, and he's uncomfortably right in our face when he's saying it. It's very effective. And then there's a dramatically similar but completely astonishing shot of TS's teacher, who's also not at all on his side, and as he moves in with his nasty criticism of the boy, it feels that the amount of depth within his face is increasing the closer he gets. It's like the interaxial is slightly widening on the fly, or maybe it's a shift in the convergence point, I don't know, but either way, it's another extremely effective shot and superb 3D. There's another key part to the look of this film, which I touched on with those pop-up book chapter headings, and that's the frequent augmentation of the story with little inserted 3D graphics. So these things here are placed in strong 3D space and they look great, and there are some more basic examples like this map, which of course has clear and strong 3D, and I think I said at the top that I'd come back to the aspect ratio, and that's because this film plays around with it a few times. Now, some 3D films occasionally break the borders, but if it's done on a 2.39:1 film, then it's something that I don't personally appreciate, which I'm sure is the same for everyone who uses a fixed frame 2.39:1 projection screen. But what this film does brilliantly though is to very subtly draw the border up or down a tiny bit, which they managed to do almost without being noticed here as the borders moved alongside the camera movement, and then the object just breaks that newly created false border, so it's all contained within an overall 2.39:1 frame. It's clever and effective and a perfect way to do it. The last of these little graphic CG 3D shots is a lovely treat, seeing the main credits through the lenses of an old Viewmaster, which is a device that introduced so many people to the joys of 3D in the first place. So just a very quick word about the film itself. I think this is a really lovely film that's essentially about the strange places the mind can travel to in coping with grief. The story centres on a 10-year-old boy with an extraordinary invention and the journey that takes him on, all set against the background of a tragedy. And the three young kids in it are all great. TS himself is especially likeable, and there's a bunch of nicely defined and played characters that he meets along the way. It's a gorgeous looking film with a quirky charm about it, and despite that tragic backdrop, it's a fun ride. A bit surprising is one scene, suddenly with some very heavy-duty swearing, which feels a bit out of place. Then again, this was directed by a Frenchman, so maybe that explains it. Anyway, I think this is an absolutely essential addition to anyone's 3D Blu-ray collection. It really ought to come up more often and higher up on those lists of the great 3D films, and I can't help wondering if maybe its somewhat awkward and unwieldy title has worked against it a bit over the years, but this is a solid gold 3D classic. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.